I had always been the kind of person who found comfort in routine. Waking up, heading to work, completing my tasks, going home, and repeating the process. There was a sense of stability in it. Even after nearly 5 years at Smith Industries, a lot had shifted. Colleagues came and went, the office relocated twice, but I still felt like just another small piece in a much larger system. Sure, I put in effort and did my job well, but it never seemed like I would break out of the cycle. And to be honest, I didn't mind. It was easier that way. That morning, I sat at my desk, staring at my computer screen. Everything was as usual: the never ending stream of emails, reports that needed completing, and the steady hum of office noise in the background. My coffee was the perfect temperature as I took a sip, gazing at the blank document in front of me. For once, I had a moment to breathe. But the peace didn't last. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my phone vibrate. It was a message from my boss, Charles Smith. "Can you come to my office for a moment?" I stared at the message, feeling an unexpected chill creep up my spine. What did he need from me? Charles wasn't the kind of person to call meetings for minor matters. My mind started racing. Had I made a mistake? Was I about to get in trouble? I couldn't think of anything I had done wrong, but a growing sense of unease settled in my chest. Taking a deep breath, I stood up and walked down the long hallway toward his office. The usual office sounds seemed louder than normal, almost unsettling, but I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe I was just overthinking. Still, I couldn't shake the nervous energy building inside me. When I reached Charles's office, I knocked on the door, trying to suppress the anxiety pressing against my ribs. "Come in." I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Charles sat behind his massive mahogany desk, dressed in his usual gray suit, his silver hair neatly combed back. But something felt different. There was tension in the air. Whether it was just me or something real, I wasn't sure. Then I noticed her. Sitting across from Charles, casually flipping through a magazine, was his wife, Julia. My stomach dropped. I had met Julia several times before. She was always present at company events, greeting people with polite smiles and engaging in effortless small talk. At least, that's what I had assumed about her. She was elegant, stunning, always surrounded by wealth, distant, almost too perfect. We had never had a real conversation beyond the occasional greeting, but for some reason, I always felt a little out of place in her presence. Not that I had any reason to. She was, after all, my boss's wife. Yet something about her was intimidating. Charles glanced at me, his usual stern expression softening slightly as he motioned for me to sit. "Aiden," he said, "have a seat. We need to talk." I lowered myself into the chair, my nerves heightening. I had no idea what this was about, but Julia's presence made me even more uneasy. What was this? What did they want from me? Charles cleared his throat, leaning forward with his hands clasped. "I've been thinking, Aiden. You've been with the company for quite some time now. You're dependable, hardworking, and someone I trust." His voice was calm, but the weight of his words made my pulse quicken. I shifted slightly. "Thanks. I appreciate that." Charles paused, locking eyes with me before continuing. "I have a task for you, an important one." I felt my heartbeat quicken. Was this it? The moment I had been waiting for? Was I about to receive a promotion, or worse, be let go? "What kind of task?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "It's a special assignment," he said, leaning back. "We're sending you on a business trip to China." "But you won't be going alone?" His gaze shifted toward Julia. "You'll be accompanying Julia." I blinked. "Excuse me?" Julia looked up from her magazine, her eyes meeting mine with a slight smirk. There was a flicker of amusement there, but I couldn't tell if it was genuine or something else entirely. Either way, her expression didn't ease my confusion. "You'll be traveling with Julia," Charles repeated, his tone firm. "She has some things to handle, and I need someone I trust to assist her." I stared at him, struggling to find words. Did he really just assign me to a trip to China? With his wife? This wasn't just another work task. This was something else entirely. Of all the scenarios I had considered, this was nowhere on my radar. Being paired with Julia Smith, a woman whose world was nothing like mine, felt surreal. But Charles had already made his decision. There was nothing I could say to change it. After a pause, I gave a small nod. "Of course," I finally said, my voice detached from my swirling thoughts. "I'll do it." Charles nodded in approval. "Good. You leave tomorrow evening. Pack your things. A car will pick you up in the morning." I didn't know how to react. My mind was flooded with questions, but I knew there was no point in asking. The decision had been made. I was going to China with Julia. That night, as I packed my bags, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. I had never been assigned to a business trip this significant before, let alone one involving my boss's wife. Something about this felt off, like I was stepping into something much bigger than I realized. And somehow I knew this trip was going to change everything. I spent the night restless, tossing and turning, unable to fall asleep. Whether it was anxiety or the unpredictability of what lay ahead, I couldn't tell. No matter the reason, I couldn't shake the gut feeling that this trip was going to be unlike anything I had ever experienced. The next morning, a car was already waiting outside my apartment, ready to take me to the airport. I climbed inside, attempting to clear my thoughts, but all I could focus on was the fact that I would be spending the next several days in China, of all people, with Julia Smith. This was definitely not the kind of work trip I had ever envisioned. The drive to the airport seemed to drag on endlessly, though maybe that was just my own mind running in circles. My thoughts were tangled with uncertainties, doubts, and countless imagined scenarios. I kept replaying the conversation in Charles's office over and over, still trying to make sense of the situation I had gotten myself into. Julia Smith, who I had only ever known as my boss's wife, always elegant yet distant, was now my companion on an overseas business trip. I couldn't help but wonder why she needed me to go with her. Was this trip about something personal? Had Charles maneuvered me into a situation I wasn't prepared for? Questions kept piling up, but I had no answers. As the car pulled up to the terminal, I stepped out, inhaling deeply. The sky was cloudy, and the air carried a slight chill. The driver retrieved my luggage, and I made my way toward the entrance. The airport was bustling with activity, and for a brief moment, the lively atmosphere drowned out the noise in my head. After clearing security, I entered the waiting area and quickly spotted Julia near the gate. As composed as ever, she wore a tailored coat, her hair styled to perfection. She stood flipping through her phone, completely at ease, while I still struggled to wrap my head around how strange this entire situation felt. I approached her, doing my best to appear composed. "Hey, Julia." She looked up and greeted me with a warm smile, completely unbothered by it all. "Aiden, glad to see you made it." I nodded, though my attention was barely on our exchange. My nerves were already getting the better of me. "Of course," I said under my breath. "Ready for the flight?" She tilted her head slightly, an unreadable glint in her eyes. "I suppose so," she replied, her tone carrying an edge of mystery. "I think we're both in for quite the adventure, don't you?" I forced a small smile, uncertain of how to respond. "Yeah, definitely." We boarded the plane, and I settled into the seat beside her. The flight to China was long, far too long to be comfortable. I found it difficult to make small talk, but Julia, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease. She spent the flight reading, checking her emails, and occasionally glancing at me with that same unreadable expression. Meanwhile, I was completely lost in my own thoughts. The entire situation felt surreal. What exactly was my role in this trip? Was I just there to assist her? Had Charles merely wanted me out of the office for a few days? Or was there something deeper going on? The more I tried to figure it out, the more frustrating it became. At last, the plane began its descent, and I was jolted back to reality. Below us, Beijing sprawled out, a vast cityscape of sleek modern skyscrapers intertwined with centuries-old architecture. I tried to focus on the view, but my mind remained tangled with uncertainty. The airport was packed when we arrived. We moved through customs and toward baggage claim, where a driver waited, holding a sign with my name on it. Julia, as always, carried herself with effortless poise, unfazed by the chaos of the crowded terminal. She walked with confidence, her head held high while I felt out of place. Like a tourist unsure of what to expect next. The driver led us to a sleek black sedan, and we were soon weaving through the city streets. As I looked out the window, I couldn't help but be struck by the grandeur of Beijing. The towering buildings, the blend of old and new, a city of striking contrasts. It was hard not to admire it. When we arrived at the hotel, I was taken aback by its opulence. The lobby was pristine, adorned with intricate designs that reflected both modern luxury and deep cultural heritage. As we checked in, I stole a glance at Julia. She seemed completely at home, as if she belonged in a place like this. A world of refinement, wealth, and sophistication, far removed from my own. The receptionist handed us our room keys, and I followed Julia to the elevator. When the doors opened onto our floor, I noticed something unexpected. Our rooms were right next to each other. It was a small detail, but it struck me as odd. Charles had arranged all of this, and it didn't feel like a coincidence. I couldn't understand why he had placed us so close, especially considering the strictly professional nature of our relationship. We exchanged brief goodnights in the hallway before retreating to our rooms. Inside, I set my luggage down and wandered over to the window, staring out at the city below. I had no idea what the next few days would bring, but I had a strong feeling they would change everything. I unpacked some of my belongings and took a quick shower, hoping to shake off the exhaustion from the trip. Despite the undeniable luxury of the hotel, the room felt impersonal, perfectly arranged but unfamiliar, as if it belonged to someone else. Later that night, I sat at the desk, working on my laptop, trying to catch up on emails and finalize a few lingering projects. There was plenty to do, but I kept getting distracted, my thoughts returning to the same unanswered questions. Why had Charles sent me here? What exactly was I supposed to do? Just as I was about to shut down my laptop for the night, a soft knock echoed from the door. I froze. Who would be visiting me at this hour? Slowly, I got up and made my way to the door, unsure of what to expect. When I opened it, I was met with the sight of Julia, standing there with a bottle of whiskey in her hand. For a brief moment, I was at a loss for words. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice smooth and self-assured. I hesitated, unsure how to respond, but before I could find the words, she stepped past me and entered the room. "I thought we could have a drink," she said casually, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. I was caught off guard. I don't drink," I admitted, still trying to process her sudden arrival. She gave me a knowing smile, her eyes gleaming. "Oh, come on. Just one drink. It's been a long day. We should unwind a little." I hesitated. A part of me wanted to tell her to leave, to put some distance between us. But something about this moment, about her, kept me from doing so. Reluctantly, I nodded. "All right, just one." She poured 2 drinks and handed me one. We clinked our glasses together, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like I had escaped reality. Away from the pressure of work, away from the unanswered questions swirling in my head. We talked, or rather, Julia talked. She spoke about the weight of her life, about her marriage to Charles, about how everything appeared perfect on the surface but felt hollow beneath it. It wasn't what I had expected. She wasn't just some wealthy woman drifting through life with everything handed to her. No, there was something deeper beneath it all. As the evening stretched on, I found myself completely absorbed in her words. The whiskey made it easier to lower my defenses, easier to listen without judgment. And yet, I couldn't tell if it was her voice or the strange connection forming between us that truly had me hooked. By the time the night had faded, we had spoken about everything and nothing at all. I found myself in a daze, unsure of what had just transpired. Julia smiled at me, her expression softer now, wearied by the late hour. "Thank you for listening," she murmured. I wasn't sure how to reply, so I simply nodded. "Of course." Then, just before she left, she leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I closed the door behind her, still trying to make sense of what had happened. My thoughts swirled in a chaotic mix of emotions, none of which I could fully grasp. What did this mean? And why did it feel like something between us had shifted? The days blurred together after that night. Each morning, I woke up in an unfamiliar city. Each night, I found myself lost in thought, trying to untangle the emotions that wouldn't leave me alone. I couldn't stop thinking about Julia. It wasn't just her presence, it was her words, her openness, the unexpected way she had revealed a side of herself I hadn't anticipated. Her soft, knowing smile lingered in my thoughts, no matter how hard I tried to push it away. Before this trip, I had been so certain of my place in the world, so sure of where I was heading. But now everything felt uncertain, as though I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't quite comprehend. Julia remained as composed as ever during the day, but I began to notice cracks in the facade. Small, fleeting moments when something raw and unguarded slipped through. The way she gazed out the window, lost in thought. The distant look in her eyes. The quiet sighs she let out when she thought no one was watching. It was like a storm was raging inside her, and for the first time, I was beginning to catch glimpses of it. But I had no idea what to do with that realization. Work was demanding, of course. We spent our days in meetings, negotiating business deals, forming partnerships, and delivering presentations to clients. I understood now why Charles had sent me. He wanted me to learn, to experience firsthand how things worked in this high-stakes world. But truthfully, none of that mattered anymore. Not when every moment spent with Julia made it impossible to focus on anything else. The tension between us was impossible to ignore. Even during business meetings, there were stolen glances, subtle smiles exchanged when no one was looking. And when we were alone in the hotel, the air between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken words as if something inevitable was on the verge of happening. I was growing restless. I couldn't keep pretending nothing was happening. One evening, after another long day of work, we ended up sitting together at a small cafe near the hotel. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and the night air felt strangely heavy. I watched Julia as she absent-mindedly stirred her tea, the silence stretching between us. And I knew. She felt it too. The growing tension. The pull we could no longer ignore. Finally, she spoke. "Aiden," she said softly, her voice quieter than usual. "I think we need to talk." I froze, my pulse quickening. Was she about to tell me this was all a mistake? That whatever was happening between us needed to stop? The thought of losing this, whatever it was almost too much to bear, even though I still didn't fully understand it. "About what?" I asked, my voice betraying my uncertainty. She lifted her gaze to mine, her expression unwavering. "About us." I swallowed hard. This was it. The moment everything changed. "I don't know what's happening, Aiden," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But something has shifted. I can't pretend it hasn't." She exhaled, looking almost unsure for the first time since I had known her. "You're different," she continued. "There's something about you that makes me feel real, and I don't know if I should feel this way, but I do." Her words hit me like a tidal wave. I wanted to respond, to tell her that I felt it too, that I understood. But no words came. Instead, I simply nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. She was right. Everything had changed. "I never expected things to turn out like this," she admitted, her fingers tightening around her cup. "When I invited you on this trip, it was supposed to be strictly business. But somewhere along the way, it became something else." I could hear the weight behind her words, and I understood completely. I had felt it too, the connection, the silent understanding that had grown between us. But I was afraid. Afraid of what it meant, afraid of where it could lead. "I don't know what to say, Julia," I confessed. "I never imagined I'd find myself in a situation like this, but I can't deny that there's something here, something real." She met my eyes, her expression softening. "I don't know what it is either," she murmured, "but I can't keep pretending it's not there." She leaned back in her chair, her face a mix of relief and frustration. "But this isn't simple," she sighed. "You work for Charles, and I'm married." Her words hit me like a punch to the stomach. It felt like reality had just smacked me in the face, forcing me to acknowledge something I'd been pushing aside. She had a husband, a fact I had never forgotten, yet one that suddenly seemed impossible to ignore. And still, here we were, discussing emotions neither of us should have been feeling. "I know," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "None of this is easy." "No," she whispered, "but it's real." The silence between us stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts. There was so much that neither of us was willing to say, yet both of us understood. "I don't know what happens after this trip, Aiden," Julia finally spoke, breaking the stillness. "But I want you to know I appreciate you being here. I just don't know where this leads. Maybe we can't do anything about it." But I couldn't keep acting like nothing was happening. "I get it," I answered quietly, my mind racing. I wanted to say more, to tell her that I felt the same way, that I didn't know where this would end up either, but that I couldn't ignore it anymore. But the words never came. I didn't know how to say them. And so the conversation ended. We sat there in silence, the weight of it all pressing down on us. I had no idea what the future held, but for the first time, I understood the gravity of the choices we would have to make. When we left the cafe, it was as though nothing had changed, but I knew that everything had. Lying in bed that night, my thoughts wouldn't let me rest. I kept replaying Julia's words in my head. The pull between us was undeniable, and no matter how much I tried to resist it, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were both standing on the edge of something we could no longer control. The question was no longer if we would give in to it, but whether we could stop ourselves from doing so. The days in China had taken on a predictable rhythm, yet something about it felt off. Every morning, I woke up, got dressed, and made my way to the conference room. Julia and I sat together, often alongside Charles, going over the latest deals. But after that conversation at the cafe, everything felt different. I caught myself watching her more often, noticing the way her fingers absently touched her wedding ring, the quiet sighs she let out when she thought no one was paying attention. There was something unspoken between us, a truth neither of us had voiced, but both of us understood. Every time our eyes met, I felt it. That spark, that tension we could no longer ignore. And yet we both acted as if everything was normal, as though there wasn't something hanging between us, unacknowledged. The nights were even worse. The first few evenings after our conversation had been tense. Julia had kept her distance, retreating to herself after long days of work. I had thrown myself into my projects, trying to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how many reports I read or emails I answered, my thoughts kept drifting back to her. I told myself it was fleeting, a passing infatuation. But the truth was, I couldn't get her out of my head. Then, one night, just as I was finishing up a project, there was a soft knock at my door. My heart jumped. I already knew who it was before I even reached for the handle. Julia. I hesitated for just a second, unsure of what to say or what this moment would mean. But before I could speak, she gave me a small smile as if nothing had changed. "Working late?" she asked, her voice quiet but laced with something unspoken. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. "Just finishing up a few things." She stepped into the room but didn't sit right away. Instead, she moved toward the window, gazing out at the glowing city below. Her presence alone seemed to make everything else fade into the background. "I thought you might want some company," she said finally, turning to face me. I didn't know how to respond. A part of me wanted to tell her to leave, to put space between us before things went too far. But another part of me, one I wasn't sure I could resist, was drawn to her as if I had no choice. The tension between us had been building for days, and I knew we couldn't keep avoiding it. Instead of answering, I simply gestured toward the chair across from mine. "You can sit if you'd like." She walked over, settling into the chair, crossing her legs and resting her elbows on her knees. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us grew heavier with every passing second. I wanted to say something, anything, but I didn't know how. I wanted to tell her everything, to express how I felt, to finally voice all the unsaid things between us. But something stopped me. I wasn't sure I was ready to face the truth of what was happening. At last, she broke the silence. "Aiden, do you ever feel like you're living a life that isn't yours?" I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean?" She sighed, her gaze distant. "I don't know, like everything is planned out for you and you just go along with it without ever questioning if it's really what you want? But deep down, you know it's not truly you. That's how I feel sometimes, like I'm living for someone else." Her words struck something deep inside me. I had always felt that way, always followed expectations, done what was required. But now, standing in this room with Julia across from me, I could see another possibility, a different path, one that wasn't dictated by anyone else. "I understand," I said quietly. "I've spent my whole life just following the rules, but now I wonder if I've been missing something." She looked at me then, her eyes both vulnerable and intense. "I'm scared, Aiden," she admitted. "I don't know what to do. I've spent so long trying to be who I'm supposed to be, but now I don't even know what's real anymore." I wanted to reach for her, to tell her I knew exactly how she felt, that I was struggling with the same thing. But I didn't move. I sat there, trapped between what I felt and the reality of our situation. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," I told her gently. "But I think you deserve to know what's real, just like I do." She gave me a small smile, but it was tinged with sadness, never fully reaching her eyes. "Maybe," she whispered. "But the problem is, Aiden, reality doesn't always make sense. And the choices we make, they can change everything." Her words settled deep in my chest. She was right. What we were feeling, what we were doing, it didn't make sense. But that didn't change the fact that it was real. And that was what scared me most of all. The silence between us stretched, the barriers we had carefully built around ourselves beginning to crack. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in days, I knew I wasn't alone in this struggle. Then suddenly, Julia stood up, shattering the moment. "I should let you get some rest. We have an early morning." I nodded, though a part of me wanted to ask her to stay, to keep talking, to figure this out. But I didn't. She paused at the door before turning back to me. "Thank you, Aiden," she said softly, "for listening, for being here." I watched her go, my heart heavy with everything we hadn't said. The door shut behind her, and I sat in the stillness. wondering just how much further we could push this before it all collapsed around us. I'd always taken pride in having control over my life, over my decisions. But ever since Julia and I had grown closer, that sense of control had begun to unravel, piece by piece, until I no longer recognized where I was headed. The boundary between what I should do and what I wanted had blurred beyond recognition. When I woke up the next morning, the hotel room felt different. Outside, the city stretched endlessly, but it felt far away, as though I were detached from the world around me. Everything that had built up over the past few days, our conversations, the late nights, the moments that lingered, had all led to this. I knew what was coming. I just didn't know if I was ready. Dragging myself out of bed, I went through my usual routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. The weight of an impending decision pressed down on me like something tangible, suffocating. A sudden knock at my door made me freeze. My pulse quickened. It was too early for business meetings, too early for anything, really. But I already knew who it was. I opened the door, and there stood Julia. She looked exhausted, but her expression was resolute. She had that look again, the one that made everything else fade away. "We need to talk, Aiden," she said softly. I nodded and stepped aside. She didn't wait for an invitation, walking straight to the window. She stood there for a long moment, staring out at the city below, her face unreadable. "I know what you're thinking," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I know I've put you in a difficult position." I stayed silent. I didn't know what to say. What could I say? I was in the same impossible place I had been for days, torn between my feelings for her and the reality of what we were doing. I had always been able to keep my life neatly divided, to remain professional. But now everything was different. "Julia," I started, my voice unsteady despite myself. "What are we doing?" I swallowed hard before continuing. This isn't right. You're married, and I'm just your husband's employee. This can't lead anywhere." Her gaze met mine then, and I saw something in her eyes. Something raw, something I had never seen before. "I know," she said quietly. "I know it's not right, but it's real, Aiden. What we've shared, what we've talked about, it's real, and I can't pretend otherwise anymore." I stepped back, my mind racing. "But what about Charles?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "What about your marriage?" She flinched, her face tightening under the weight of my words. "Charles is a good man," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But he's not the man I need. He's not the man I want. And I haven't been honest with him or with myself for a long time." I let out a shaky breath. The words I had been holding back, words I didn't even fully understand myself, hovered on the edge of my lips. But before I could say them, Julia turned to face me completely. Her eyes pleaded with me to understand. "I'm not asking you to make a choice, Aiden," she said. "I'm not expecting you to throw everything away for me, to risk your career. That's not what this is about." She hesitated, lowering her gaze to the floor. "But what I feel for you, it's real, and I can't just walk away from it." There it was. The truth. And as it settled between us, heavy and suffocating, I realized there was no turning back. I had spent days trying to convince myself that none of it was real, that I could simply walk away and pretend as if nothing had shifted. But everything had. The bond between us was undeniable, and the more I ignored it, the more suffocating it became. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted in a hushed voice, the words feeling like an unspoken truth finally surfacing. "I don't know if I can live with the fallout." Julia took a step closer, her fingers lightly grazing mine. "You don't have to decide everything right now," she said gently, "but I need to know, are you willing to try?" Her question lingered in the air, pressing down on me with a weight that made it hard to breathe. I had always been the type to take the safe route, to make the choices that were expected of me. But for the first time, I was being asked to make a decision based on what I wanted. Taking a deep breath, my pulse pounding, I realized what I had to do. I had been offered a glimpse of something genuine, something that made my heart race instead of just settling into the steady beat of habit. "I'm willing to try," I said at last, my voice steady even as my thoughts swirled in chaos. "But I don't know where this will lead. I don't know what happens next." Julia's lips curved into a smile, this time a real one, not the weary, resigned expression I had grown used to. It was the kind of smile that made me believe, just for a moment, that anything was possible. "I don't either," she admitted. "But for once, that doesn't scare me. I had no idea what lay ahead. Too many uncertainties, too many questions. But for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to have all the answers. I had made my choice, and whatever happened next, I was ready to face it. The rest of the day passed in quiet contemplation, both of us lost in our own thoughts. As evening fell and we prepared to board our flight back to the US, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything would shift the moment we returned home. Would we be able to keep this hidden? Or would reality catch up to us? But as I glanced at Julia beside me, I realized those worries didn't matter. For once, I wasn't afraid to step into the unknown. I wasn't afraid to follow my heart, no matter where it led. Weeks had passed since our return from China, yet the city around me felt strangely altered, as though life continued moving while I remained frozen in place. Julia and I continued walking the tightrope between what we felt and the reality we had to live in. Our stolen moments had become our refuge, the only place where things felt real. But each time we parted, the weight of everything we were hiding came crashing down again. I hadn't anticipated it would be this difficult. I had assumed that after the whirlwind of our trip, we would find some kind of balance, at least for a little while. But the burden of secrecy gnawed at us, especially in the midst of our everyday lives. During the day, Julia maintained her usual distance, acting as if nothing had shifted between us. But I could feel the tension in every unspoken word, in the way we hesitated before making even the smallest moves, always calculating the risk of being caught. I tried to immerse myself in work, to distract myself from the constant ache of missing her. But every time I thought of her, an involuntary smile found its way to my lips. It was irrational, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Julia wasn't just the woman I had fallen for. She was a reminder that life could be more than just a series of motions, more than just obligations and expectations. That afternoon, as I made my way home from the office, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A message from Julia. "Can you meet me? I need to talk." My heartbeat quickened. By now, I knew messages like that weren't casual. When Julia said she needed to talk, it always meant something serious. I typed out a response immediately. Of course, where? Her reply came almost instantly. Same place as last time, 8 p.m. I knew exactly where she meant. A quiet little park, hidden away from the busy streets, where we had spent countless hours together. It was private, a rare sanctuary in the middle of the city, a place where we could be ourselves without worrying about watchful eyes. As the hours crawled by, anticipation settled heavily in my chest. I had a gnawing feeling that whatever she had to say wouldn't be easy to hear. Had she changed her mind? Had the secrecy become too much for her? I tried not to let my thoughts spiral, but the uncertainty pressed down on me all the same. At exactly 8 p.m., I arrived at the park. The night air was crisp, the distant hum of traffic the only sound breaking the quiet. I spotted Julia sitting on a bench beneath the glow of a street lamp, her face illuminated by the soft light. As always, she was beautiful, but tonight, something about her seemed different. There was a heaviness in her expression, a quiet storm behind her eyes. "Hey!" I greeted her softly as I approached, my voice tinged with concern. "What's going on?" Julia lifted her gaze to meet mine, an emotion I couldn't quite name flickering behind her eyes. She stood, motioning for me to sit before taking a slow breath. "I've been thinking a lot, Aiden, about us, about everything." My stomach tightened. "What are you thinking?" I asked carefully, bracing myself for whatever was coming next. She looked away for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "I can't keep living like this. I can't keep hiding." My breath caught in my throat. "I love what we have, I do," she continued, "but I can't keep pretending it's nothing. Like we're just two people in a meaningless affair. It's not fair to either of us. And it's not fair to Charles, even if he doesn't know." Her words hung between us, thick with meaning. I sat there, absorbing the weight of everything she had just said. I had known this moment was coming, that the strain of secrecy couldn't last forever, but hearing it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't ready for. "You're not saying you want to end this, are you?" I asked, my voice betraying the hint of unease I tried to suppress. Julia's expression softened as she shook her head. "No, not exactly. I don't know how much longer we can keep this up. It's starting to feel like we're living a lie." I understood exactly what she meant. It wasn't just the secrecy, but the constant tension. The fear that at any moment we could be exposed and everything would come crashing down. What we had created was beautiful, yet delicate, held together by fragile strands of secrecy and uncertainty. "I don't want to lose you," I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I can't lose you. Julia stepped closer, her fingers reaching out to brush against mine. You won't lose me, she murmured. But we have to find a way to handle this. I can't keep living like this, but I don't want to lose you either. The night was still around us as we sat in silence, both absorbed in our own thoughts. I knew she was right. This couldn't last forever. But for just a moment, I let myself cling to the hope that somehow we could make it work, that we could find a way to be together without the weight of secrecy suffocating us. In the weeks that followed, things remained just as complicated. Julia and I continued to see each other, but the strain never truly disappeared. It lingered, always present, a shadow over every interaction. We couldn't be open, couldn't be free. Yet in those stolen moments we managed to share, I found comfort. I found love. And for the time being, that was enough. Julia was still married to Charles, and we both understood that keeping our secret indefinitely wasn't possible. But as we moved forward, carving out slivers of time in a world that seemed intent on keeping us apart, we clung to one belief: that real love was worth fighting for, even if it meant staying in the shadows a little longer.